Welcome to Dynasty Life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. And I had to jam in a Dynasty Life episode this week in week 12 because a lot of Dynasty managers out there, this is your trade deadline. So I had to go to the mattresses. I had to bring a real one in here. I got Scott Connor from Destination Devy, been on Dynasty Life multiple times, podcasted with you a million times, Scott. You are like, everybody knows you in Dynasty, but the way I kind of describe you to people is you're kind of like an influencer for like Dynasty thought, Dynasty theory, and certainly some trades. You're willing to take a bold stance and have big objectives with your Dynasty teams, and I think people really respect that and love it. I know, like earlier this year, and we'll start off the top. Like your strategy this year with injured players, holding these guys. Like, for example, Pacheco came out earlier this year. You're talking about moving him. Are you still happy you did that with him coming back? Is that just a general theory on Dynasty?
Yeah, I mean, Theo, thank you for having me on. It's a topic that is one that definitely stirs up some controversy because, people immediately will think, okay, a player gets injured, I have to look at their long-term value potential. It's very easy to say, a 30-year-old running back gets injured and they don't have any value past right now because they're not going to be here the rest of the season. So people will say, oh yeah, that guy's not worth much. Let's just trade him away. But with somebody like Pacheco, where his injury is probably long-term, but it's not going to end his career. In fact, he's going to come back. Now, I'll say with him, he was one of the ones where I think because of where he started, because like all these things are very dynamic in terms of how players are valued, right? Pacheco started off as a nobody. Then he rose up to ranks that nobody ever thought he would get to. But then he gets injured. And at the time I said, okay, this injury, people are saying it's going to be 6 to 10 weeks. And he's a running back on a good team that probably doesn't need him to come back and necessarily help you for the fantasy playoffs specifically. So I have no problem moving him because what is the long-term loss that I could realize if everything is perfect with his recovery, he comes back and he's exactly what he was? I don't even feel that long-term loss was that much. So a player like that, you can move. If you go to maybe a player like Brandon Aiyuk, for instance, that's one where he had a little more value built in. He didn't just have he could be a wide receiver 1 this year, which he clearly was not. But he also has the quote unquote like future value, right? He's attractive to somebody that's looking past 2024. And my stance on a player like that was he really shouldn't be attractive to somebody that's looking past 2024. Is he going to bounce back? Yes. Is there going to be a window next July if you and I are on a show and I say, hey, Brandon Aiyuk's probably a pretty good guy to have going forward? Sure. But what's the opportunity cost of holding a player like that when you can get 80% of what his value was, especially if that's in the form of different value than what you were trading away? Meaning maybe I don't have to get another receiver back because I don't need to pay Brandon Aiyuk to replace Brandon Aiyuk on my team, right? I can replace him with maybe a 26 first-round pick, and then I can go buy a cheaper receiver to fill into that same spot. And the net was actually a gain for me because I have a more flexible piece. So it isn't like trade him away because I don't believe in him. In fact, a lot of these guys that get injured, they're going to come back. But what are they going to come back to where I really, really lost out by temporarily not having that player? I'm going to ask you, Theo, Chris Olave. Why is Chris Olave even thought of to be this asset that has a ton of upside? He's out for the year probably. He's going into year 4. A lot of his peripheral numbers are good, but he's never really been anything close to what you expected. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But he really shouldn't hold like top 20 dynasty receiver value. Yet there's people out there going, oh man, trade for him because next year, just wait till he's healthy. And I'm looking at him going, what is the difference between him and, you're going to call me blasphemous for this, but what's the difference between him and like Darnell Mooney?
And I think that's you sort of nailed it. It's the idea that things are going to come back the same way. Like today's price is not yesterday's price, the type mentality in Dynasty. And with Godwin, there's so many variables. Like with Aiyuk, you have the contract insulation. With a guy like Godwin, he's going to be a free agent. And we say, hey, Scott and Theo, don't you guys know maybe Godwin lands on a team that targets him 150 times? You guys could be wrong. You don't know how the NFL is going to treat them. I think that's sort of it's sort of an arrogant way of playing Dynasty. I used Chris Godwin just the other day, Scott. I needed an extra piece to get. I have a team that's going to be in contention, I think, in an FFPC 500. I'm slightly thin at running back, like a lot of my teams are constructed that way, and I know yours are as well, where maybe I have 3 guys I feel comfortable with, and I was able to pivot Godwin into a Tony Pollard. And is Tony Pollard some guy who's going to score 30 points for me in championship week? No, but he's a guy that if I need to plug him in the RB2 spot, I feel okay about doing that like next week. Chris Godwin, I don't know if he's going to have as much value as him in like 6 months anyway. So I'm with you. I think that there's a lot of like getting rid in a positive, constructive way, not just getting rid to get rid. I'm not talking about dumping guys, but if I can pivot off of a guy and have value with like a draft pick or have value with a guy that's providing utility to me right now, I think that's something dynasty theory wise that we should do more often than holding these assets that are getting 0 points for us, sitting in an IR spot, and potentially losing trade equity this offseason.
Well, let me give you this is a real life example that you can probably relate to, people that are listening. So I'll throw out a couple names. Christian Kirk, Hollywood Brown, Stefon Diggs. Like all 3 of those guys are useless. There was a point where you knew they were going to be useless going forward. And it's the same as if, maybe you run like a car dealership, right? Somebody brings in an old car and there's mechanical problems or there's something on it that needs to be fixed. You may buy it because you think you might be able to repair it and sell it for more than what you paid, right? But there becomes a point where if you lose a guy like Christian Kirk or Hollywood Brown or Stefon Diggs, the value is actually just recouping something, because what you're losing is probably not something that you can't replace at a later time. And there's still risk that those players are going to even come back and be locked into your rotation of receivers. I mean, those 3 guys I mentioned, all 3 could come back next year, be usable, right? But they could also be in a range where, has Tyler Lockett been usable this year? Not really. Like, he's there. He's healthy. He hasn't been injured. He hasn't been completely phased out. But you haven't looked at him and gone, okay, I know I'm getting top 36 production or better. And that kind of feels like what those guys are. So I don't look at like Christian Kirk of, he could come back next year and be exactly what he was. I'm willing to say, okay, I know short term, he's not going to have hardly any value. But long term, I'm even willing to punt the potential long-term value just because even if I lose, what do I actually lose? A guy that I could trade for a second next summer? Whereas today, all I might be able to get for him is Trey Sermon for 3 starts, which weren't good. But that's all I could get. And people go, I'll just hold on to Christian Kirk. But what you're losing isn't that high in the future. So I have no real tolerance to keep those guys when they get injured. And that goes for a lot of different players. Now, I've had some leagues, Theo, where I have Christian Kirk, and you know what? Nobody will even take him.
No,
like they won't even count him as credit in a deal to give me anything useful. So in that case, you got to package him up with something else. Hey, he's a throw-in. I'll throw him into this deal and essentially motivate you to make the deal by throwing those guys in. But I'm done waiting on players unless I can very specifically tell you a story to where next year I am going to take a big loss if this bounces back to what it is. And there's been a lot of victory laps on some players, and let me ask you this. I sold Nick Chubb for 3rds last year. I probably lost out on a guy that I might be able to sell for a second now, right? But did I really lose much, Theo? Other than like maybe a couple chances to shop him around and maybe get the second? I didn't actually lose anything that is costing my team the future. Do you know what I mean? I have no harm taking a loss just to clear out the spot and give me something more flexible to work with now, even if it's less value.
Yeah, and I think you put that absolutely perfectly. It's about flexibility with roster. And I think one thing that you guys do a very good job of on Dynasty Trades in 5 is talking about making a second deal. So like tiering up or tiering down, in any way you're doing it, you're accumulating assets that you can move at a future date. Where with Nick Chubb, there was a chance it went to absolute 0. Your 3rd round pick is going to be a 3rd round pick. So I agree with that one. And I think also having certain running back profiles on your roster Scott, where you have a guy like Chubb, you might have cost yourself some poor spot starts where, a guy fell in the end zone 2 times, when we're at the day after. We're recording this on Friday. So like to Nick, it was great seeing Nick Chubb get the touchdowns. Like you love seeing that. But that's few and far between, I think, with his profile and the free agency upcoming. We're going to dive into a little bit of tearing up, tearing down. We're going to talk about a couple of last-minute trade targets, and we're going to talk about some general dynasty theory. Theo Gremminger with Scott Connor. Stick with us here at Dynasty Life. We'll be right back.
Oh, every week I'm answering these start-sit questions on Sunday morning. I go to the weekly rankings on playerprofiler.com just to make sure that my instincts are correct, and sometimes they're not. And guess what? More often than not, I go with the projections. You may not feel great about starting Daniel Jones or Wan'Dale Robinson, but the projections say, hey, that's the move. It may not feel right, but you use those projections to get it right. That's the power of the Player Profiler system. It's Evan Ringler, it's Bradley Stalder, it's Theo Gremminger, of course, it's Billy Muzio making these rankings possible. The season rankings, so you know who to pick up, who to trade for. The dynasty rankings are part of this. The offensive line rankings from Dan Fornick, one of the best in the business. Then we get our cornerback rankings, which show which corners are matched up with which wide receivers. And now, in collaboration with the IDP show, we have IDP rankings. Did you know that? Did you? So go to playerprofiler.com, use promo code PODFATHER. Get you 25% off the player rankings package right now at playerprofiler.com. Enjoy!
So, Scott, heading into break, I talked a little bit about tearing up and tearing down. If you're maybe a first-time listener to Dynasty Life, or you haven't heard Scott, why don't you break it down, like just sort of in a very short, condensed way, what tearing up and tearing down is for Dynasty?
Well, I think it's definitely a cyclical thing. I mean, I've been guilty in the past of being obsessively compulsive with trying to just tear down, accumulate as much stuff as possible. But you don't live your life that way, right? You don't accumulate as much stuff in your house as possible, because at some point you're going to go, man, I would love for somebody to come into my closet and just clean everything out and just give me $50 for the contents. You know what I mean? There might be $500 worth of stuff in my garage, but if you just give me 50 and come take it all out, that's worth it to me. And it's kind of the same thing in Dynasty. Like, you can only accumulate so many draft picks. You can only accumulate so many players where you've relegated them to there's only going to be future value in these guys. So I think it starts with understanding your format. Like, everybody in here that's listening probably plays in different types of leagues, 10 by 8, 12 by 15. Like, there's a wide variety. So I do think there's some math that you have to figure out before, Theo. You need to know how many starters. You need to know how many roster spots. You need to know the rules with how those go up and down throughout the season, IR spots, taxi spots, all those things. And then you kind of got to figure out, like, what is the sweet spot? Like, if I have FFPC, for instance, like, there is a certain devaluation of draft picks to an extent. Like, you don't want to have 9 first-round picks. Now, 9 first-round picks is good because you can hoard out everybody from getting access to those players. But how do you beat the team in the FFPC that has 12 draft picks, Theo? They can't keep them all. So if you just said, hey, great, you have half of next year's draft, you still have to cut your roster down to a certain point. So as long as we don't kowtow to what you need, which is an eventual consolidation or tier up trade, your strategy is going to be lost eventually. You're going to just bleed value because you don't have the capacity. Same with tearing down. Like, you don't want to tear down to the point where, you have too many players and then you're cutting a backup running back to draft a backup running back. You start getting into things like that, and it's just you're on top of yourself in terms of your resources. So I think you got to understand that math. Then I think that it depends on how in your, I guess you would say, competition cycle of your dynasty team that you want to play it. I think there's always time, even if you're a competing team, to be tearing up and tearing down. So I think it just comes down to understanding or even making bets where you have player tiers and just saying, this range, I'm comfortable tearing down. If there's a move where later on I can tear up, and maybe in each move, one of them takes you out of a tier. You get a tier up, right? But then another trade, you may get a tier down where you don't view it as a tier down, but the other manager does. That's how you could do both. And you also end up right back at the same spot that you were from like a numbers perspective or a roster construction standpoint, but both of them have a place. So I don't know if that kind of gives the theory as to the why, but I don't think it's just, if you're rebuilding, you're trying to split assets and tear down. And I also don't think that it's just if I'm a contender, I'm only looking to tier up. Now, sure, I want to tier up to the best players possible, but a lot of times we take that too far and we start saying we're tiering up from this player to this player when really like the range of outcomes for those players is not that much different. Like I'm not adding a first round pick onto a wide receiver 3 to get a low end wide receiver 1, because from a week to week, like spike week potential standpoint, they're not different. So that's not where I'd want to use my tier up asset. Now, if I'm tiering up from a wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 1, I have no problem giving the extra first round pick, or going from a quarterback that's scoring 19 points per game to 24 points per game. Okay, I can stomach giving up a first round pick there because I'm locking in the actual tier up value. It's not this fake, KTC says Malik Neighbors is wide receiver 4. So let me add a first onto Jackson Smith and Jigba to get Malik Neighbors. Like right now, with where we stand, that's probably not a deal I'm aggressively trying to do, even though a trade calculator would say, oh, that's a tier up that I'd want to do. Does that make sense?
No, it makes total sense. I think you explained it very well. And I think that it's sort of a, hey, I have a team that's rebuilding, therefore I needed to automatically tier down. Or, hey, I've got a team that's a contender right now. I need to push the chips in and do some 3-for-1s and throw a pick in there and make sure I get that guy. I think a skill that dynasty managers need to understand is, and it's not even really a hard one, it's when you push the chips in to go and get an elite player, you better be sure that it is an elite player. We don't want to be necessarily a speculator. Now, there's going to be some exceptions to this rule. Certainly when a guy like Bijan Robinson becomes available and you really believe in the profile, you believe in the landing spot, and you believe in sort of where he's at in terms of valuation, there's going to be some times where it's not like a seen it first type mentality. But I think a lot of times, I think you nailed it perfectly. You can end up losing the trade while giving up the first round pick. Now, that might be 40% of the time, might be 30% of the time, but it's enough percent of the time that it can really, really burn you. So I think it's really difficult when you kind of gauge that tier up, tier down thing. So I really like the way you explain that. Let's talk specifically about contending teams right now, because I think if you're watching this, you probably are a contender. Now, shout out to some of the people that are rebuilding. We're glad you're watching here, but a lot of times the interest level kind of wanes a little bit for fantasy content when you're pushing through with like 2 wins right now. So let's say that I'm a contender. Who are a couple of players that you would be looking to acquire for the short term, Scott?
Well, short term, when you said some players for the short term, I mean, I'll be completely honest. The way that I've played Dynasty for the last couple of years, my short term is literally like the right now, this week, next week. And it kind of goes back real quick to the tier down thing. I think tiering down is best used when you're trying to accumulate something, right? Like if you're trying to accumulate extra, if you're trying to it's like getting a second job. You don't have to do it, but you may want to do it because you want to get a little money extra in the bank. Like that's kind of what I'm looking at tiering down doing. Now, if you can have your cake and eat it too, imagine if I said, Theo, you need to make an extra $500 a month. You need to go get a second job. But you can work that second job in between the downtime of your primary job. That's essentially what a tier down trade's goal is, right? Like I'm not committing any extra, or I'm not losing something away from what I'm already doing. So if I can tier down, let's say I think Theo likes this receiver a little better than the one that he has, and I'll be, a little honest with the way dynasty managers play today. Dude, I've seen people tier down because their guy they have is on a bye. They'll literally make a deal for another player. I kind of like that other player a little better. Oh, and my guy's on a bye, so I'll do that trade. So I trade you a player. You give me another receiver at the same position and a 2026 second round pick. I'm looking at that going, I kind of like this deal because the receiver I'm getting, eventually I can put right into that same spot for the guy I traded away. And I took on that second job and I netted that second round pick, right? When I'm tiering up, I'm looking at that as like, I just got a raise. I can now kind of splurge. So I don't want to speculate when I'm tearing up. Like you said, I think you nailed it. You don't want to pay the tax or pay the extra unless you are sure what you're getting is going to be realized. So when I say, guys I want to buy going forward, I think we're pretty bad as a fantasy community to say, for sure, I know this player is better than the player I'm trading away. Just because you're tacking a second onto a player for a quote-unquote upgrade, what are you basing that on? Maybe some data, but there's still a lot of variance that comes into play. So I would just say I'm careful when I tier up that I'm actually tiering up, not an opinion, not KTC's value, but I'm actually getting a boost from what I'm doing. So my player specifically for a stretch buy player was Will Dissly. And you were a little shocked when I said Will Dissly, but I looked at Will Dissly and
it wasn't as exciting as I expect you to say, Scott, but when I'm excited to hear the reasoning.
Here's the reason. So we have the Trinity Score over at DD. Will Dissly has been not a great, but I think every acquisition that you make is going to be based on what they cost, right? And he's right up there. If you just isolate him with tight ends, like he's right up there in the top 10, pretty much in the league in terms of usage over the last half of the season. He doesn't have any future value. He doesn't have probably a ceiling, but what is a ceiling at tight end, especially if you're in one of these leagues where, it's 1.75 premium or even 1.5, like it could be a flex, but the key is you're getting him for a fraction of the cost that you would pay for somebody else. So that's why I put him in there. I think he's probably in that flex range, and you just make sure if you're buying him, you have a spot to put him in. So this is probably speaking to people that are in, maybe leagues that have 11 starters or more, or some of your deeper dynasty leagues, but I've bought a couple shares of them, and it's really just because what it would cost to go buy a more sexy name, like go try to buy Cedric Tillman from somebody. Hell, go try to buy like Jerry Jeudy from somebody. Go try to buy Wan'Dale Robinson from somebody. Like you're going to pay the dynasty tax for those guys, right? They're going to go, oh, he's still young. I'm going to charge you a little bit extra because they're also being productive right now. Will Dissly, I think it's found money. So you're actually more likely to get the seller to sell because they probably look at it like, wow, I'm actually getting something for, the piece of paper that I found on the playground last week. They don't think it's actually something that has any long-term value. So they're more likely to cash in the ticket.
I like it. And I actually had Will Dissly as like a top 4 waiver wire ad this past week in my article at Player Profiler because the role is great. And it's consistency in the role lately, Scott, where the guy's getting at least 6 targets every single week. Let's back up a step because I've had Ray Garvin on this show. I've had him on press coverage, but you guys are continually referencing the Trinity Score. Just break down what the Trinity Score is for anybody who doesn't know. You guys are constantly referencing it at Destination Devy. It's very cool.
Yeah, so the Trinity Score is essentially, it's all of the stuff that people usually cite for receivers, but it's all combined into a proprietary score. It's been tested. The key about the Trinity that I think separates it from a lot of the other tools is it was tested for its predictiveness from one year to another. So Ray took a lot of these metrics. I mean, it includes things like air yard share, target share, yards after the catch, yards per route run. Like there's proprietary things that go into it with its own formula. But the key was trying to project it from year to year. And it's the usage in a specific offense. So I think people see it. They'll look at the graphs. They'll look at each individual player, and they'll immediately think, okay, I should compare George Pickens to T. Higgins, which is incorrect. They have two totally different offenses. So it's looking at higher Trinity Score is going to equate to higher stuff that receiver is doing that predictively leads to fantasy production. And that's why there's a regression line. So you can easily spot players that have a high Trinity Score, but a low production score, right? And you're probably like, okay, I can tell myself why that's the case. They're on a bad offense. They have a bad quarterback. Like it doesn't always mean they're going to go 1 for 1. High Trinity means high production, but it shows opportunity. It's the best way for us to figure out, okay, where can I look at the market? And the cool thing is you can literally pull up like the Trinity Score and then look up players' values side by side and go, okay, there's 2 similar players. They have similar roles in their offense. One of them's valued here. One of them's valued here. So it's actually perfect for the way people play Dynasty now, because you find new players pop up all the time. You can look at players over the last couple weeks and go, okay, that guy's getting a lot more opportunity in the last week or two than before. If that continues, he's probably somebody that I can start. And I'm not even looking at who they play, their matchups, none of that. It just measures opportunity within their offense. And you can use it the other way too. There's players on here that have just straight up fake value. You look at they're still valued as a second round pick on Keep Trade Cut. Their role in the offense is one you would never want to start. And they might have had a touchdown here or, a couple big PPR games here, but that doesn't mean they're getting the opportunity. And usually those things, target share, air yard share, yak, those lead to the formula leads to fantasy points. So that's what it is in a nutshell. It's an opportunity score. Like Ray likes to say, it tells me what receivers are doing the shit that scores points.
Yeah, and it's a cool thing, and I think that people will learn more about it as they become more familiar with it, and you and Ray make it sort of part of our fantasy football vernacular. Let's keep talking older veterans. You talked to Will Dissly. I've been, this time of year, cleaning up a little bit of my running back depth and also sometimes in some cases, my RB2 spot. Your interest level in players like Tony Pollard, James Conner, J.K. Dobbins this time of year, if you have a contending roster and you need a running back.
Yeah, I think all of those guys are good. I just bought Tony Pollard yesterday for a second.
I did a couple of those. I have a couple of those.
And here's the thing. I accept, let me ask you, because I already know where my mind is on that. When you pay that second, Theo, you are expecting that Tony Pollard has zero residual value after this year, right? Like, you don't anticipate that he's somebody you'll be able to sell in March and he's not an asset. You look at it like, I really didn't want to pay that much for that beer at the baseball game, but I was thirsty. You know what I mean? Like, I needed it. I bought it. There really wasn't a lot of dynasty analysis that goes into play when you're buying these guys. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It's short. It's a mercenary. I need what I need. I need what I need until January 1 or whenever your league ends.
Well, and here's the beauty of it is at a second round price point, we accept that if you buy, especially James Conner, because he's even older, but if you buy a guy like James Conner, there's not really going to be, and maybe there will be, maybe the tides are returning this year with how this season has gone. You're not expecting that that's a live asset that you're going to be able to move from January to June. That's not going to be what the team that has all the draft picks and just rebuilt is necessarily going to be interested in. But the beauty of buying a guy like Tony Pollard or DeAndre Swift is another one is we went so far over the top. We've just assumed that all of these guys are just going to go to dust,
Yeah.
Whereas
and the age apex, like I'm sure me and you will talk about this offseason, but this year, all the top scorers are older running backs. And Scott, they're also staying healthier, which, hey, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but older running backs staying healthier, a little bit, it's taking care of your body. But I don't know. It's guys aren't getting hurt. So I'll just throwing that out there. That's a whole nother thing.
Do you think the market values, I'll throw out two players that have produced very similarly this year. Does the market, and when I say the market, I don't mean that if I'm doing a startup draft, who people would pick first and second, because that typically leads to people saying, oh, he's 25, he's 29. I'll pick the 25-year-old first, right?
Yeah.
But I'm talking the in-season, I need a running back dynasty market. Does the manager that has DeAndre Swift value him any differently than the manager that has Aaron Jones?
No, I think that you nailed it. They're somewhat similar in terms of their valuation. You'd put them in a similar tier.
What is the biggest barrier to getting a deal done for one of those guys?
I've been getting DeAndre Swift, I will say, like Jones, I think is actually easy to get. I've gotten him one or two spots, and I feel almost less sure about him as I do maybe a couple of the other guys I referenced, because a couple of factors. It seems like they're trying to keep him a little healthier for the actual NFL playoffs, mixing in Cam Akers a little bit more. But for me, I think it's Jones is 29, Swift is 26, 27. So I think you do get a little bit more resistance from the Swift manager than you do Aaron Jones. But when push comes to shove, if we averaged out the value of like 10 dynasty trades for those guys, it's going to be somewhat similar.
And let's go. Let's take a couple of younger guys. Maybe we can put Dobbins in that group too. But I think and Swift is amazingly only 25, which is wild.
25. There you go.
Yeah, he's the same age as Tyrone Tracy. Think about that.
Same age as T. Higgins.
Well, I think what I was kind of getting at though is a lot of times when I'm trying to buy these guys, it's not the value that's being debated. Now they may go, I'd prefer the 25-year-old to the 30-year-old, right? I get it. Aaron Jones is on the older side, so maybe that's not a great example for this. But if you're talking between the ages of 24 to 28, they're currently healthy, they're currently producing, and they have some sort of, maybe they're on their second contract, or maybe they've had the same job for a couple of years. Generally, the biggest barrier to trading those guys or getting those guys is not the price. The price seems to already be kind of like agreed upon, right? The hardest part of getting those guys is convincing the other manager to move them to you. Now, it's easy if the manager is 1 in 10. But how many 1 in 10 teams have been riding DeAndre Swift and Tony Pollard all year? They don't. All those teams, because of how we've been trained in Dynasty, if your team starts out 0-4, what does that manager usually do? It guts everything on their team, right? You look at, that's not the team you're trying to trade with. The team I traded Pollard for yesterday, I'm 6-5. They're 5-6. They have almost as good a chance of making the playoffs as me. But I had to convince them that, and maybe it wasn't even me convincing them because I didn't give them a whole soliloquy about how they need to make this trade with me. They had to look at that and say, okay, realistically, it's not DeAndre Swift or Tony Pollard versus their future value. It is really, am I motivated to keep them or am I not? So it's really, if I'm in second place and you're in third place, would you trade me, Tony Pollard, for a second?
No, probably
not. Would I
I'm
trade you, Tony Pollard, for a second? If both of us are locking him in our lineup as our RB2 every week, neither of us could give a shit what their dynasty value is, right? Both of us have, and this is trumping all of the other evaluation, both of us have a motivation to not move that player for what they are. And the edge in that case would have been, okay, wait a second. If I can maybe squeeze an extra second out of Theo, okay, I'll give you Tony Pollard. But then can I turn around and maybe I only get a second and third because you don't want to give up 2 seconds for a guy like that. But I can get a second and a third out of you. But then I can go trade a third to patchwork that spot together for 1 or 2 more weeks. I don't even know who I would get, but I could get somebody. And that's where me as a contender would go, okay, I've created now motivation to make that trade. And I'm willing just to bet against Tony Pollard, but I'm acknowledging that he's probably worth what I sold him to you for. So that's a lot of running back trades, Theo. You don't see a lot of teams where they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should rebuild now. I have Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey. They exist in a world where they're already being valued for anything but their future. So it's always, you have to pay the tax to motivate somebody else to move them, which makes it really hard to market value them.
Let's throw 2 running backs out there, and this could be a whole show, but it's really kind of a brief response. I want to get your opinion on Chase Brown and Tyrone Tracy, because both of these players have been looking, in Chase Brown's case, almost league-winning upside the last few weeks. In Tyrone Tracy's case, if Tyrone Tracy was a third-round pick who was 22 years old, I think people would be maybe going nuts about him right now in terms of dynasty value. But with these 2 guys, it's sort of a little bit of mental gymnastics. Are these guys trade targets, or if we trade for them, should we have a short-term evaluation because of potentially the profile, potentially backfield competition, just sort of variables that could present themselves next year? I traded for Chase Brown today, FFPC contender, a triflex, where I'm pretty stacked at wide receiver, and I moved Jordan Addison for him, and the guy accepted it. The guy's a losing team, and I probably gave up the longer term asset, but in terms of fantasy scoring rest of the season, Chase Brown could double him up. So I thought that was a good trade But the point being, it's like a second year back putting up this sort of numbers, but I don't need to give up a first round pick for him. To me, this is a guy that I want to go kick the tires on. So your thoughts on Brown, your thoughts on Tracy?
Well, we'll start with Brown. I mean, he's had opportunity shares of like 100% 3 straight games, 28 and a half opportunities a game over the last 3 weeks. Now, obviously, Moss got injured. They don't have another running back they trust. So that's probably not going to be the case every single week going forward. But I think with running backs, Theo, people look at a guy like Chase Brown and go, there's no way he can sustain this. And yes, that's true. But do we think he just is getting this opportunity? And like, keep in mind, he's like the RB4 over those weeks too. So he's absolutely smashing. Now, part of it's on volume, but he's also explosive. You know, he gets a lot of receptions. He can score touchdowns. Like, it's not an axe. He's not luck boxing into these touches. Like, it's not just, they don't have anybody else, so they're just giving it to him. Now, is that their long-term plan to do this for 28 straight games? No, but I think we undervalue the fact that he's doing it. So if you're buying him, yeah, do I expect this to continue into next year? No. Do I expect them to bring in another running back, if not 2 running backs? Yes. But I also think that you get the short-term production, but you know what I get with Chase Brown? I get at least another year where I have a shot at having multiple pockets of this again. And I might have a guy that has multiple pockets of this again for 4 or 5 years. Now, that doesn't mean he might not be on the lower end of that committee, right? Like, there's guys that end up on the bottom end of that type of committee, and they're not as startable as you would think. Think of like Jaleel McLaughlin this year. He's been healthy all year, but he's been on like that bottom end of the committee that he's had a committee role, but he's only given you like 7.5 points per game. Like, he's not usable. But that doesn't mean that window won't open back up. So I think when you're buying a guy like Chase Brown, yeah, sure, you're giving up Jordan Addison. But what's Jordan Addison's long-term value?
Exactly.
It's not a first unless you could turn him into a first, which you're not turning him into a first right now. And you mentioned the points per game. Like, if Jordan Addison gives you 12.5 points per game for the next 3 years, will the Dynasty community value that anymore when he's 26 years old and only scored 12 points per game for his career? Not really. He's just another guy that's gone by the wayside. You know what I mean? So that's a great trade that nobody would think of doing. They would think, okay, I only want to give up a second. But a lot of Chase Brown managers don't have a motivation to sell him for a second, even a bad team, because they're thinking, okay, next year I can probably use him for a similar role. So I love that trade. That's more creative than what I would even think. I'd only want to pay a second.
Yeah, I think that you have to get creative with Chase Brown. I've seen some people do creative packages and get Chase Brown included. I think you got to do that. But it's just odd because if I want Devon Achane, I've got to have a trade offer that includes a first. If I want Jahmyr Gibbs, I want Bijan Robinson, I'm paying 100%. A Godfather offer, but I'm getting the same production, the same time in the league, albeit something that could go to nothing.
And dude, that's just straight bias. And another tip that I've found helpful, let's say I can't get Chase Brown for a second or Tyrone Tracy for a second, and that's who I want. Isn't it nice to be able to have like a Christian Kirk you can throw in there too? That's the perfect way. If you can't sell the Christian Kirk for anything, tack him onto the deal. And people go, ooh, you paid a lot there, but did you really? And another thing that I've found very helpful over the last 4 or 5 weeks, sometimes I get a little too obsessive with cycling these players off my team too quick. But man, it was really nice to have a couple extra Jalen McMillans or Jermaine Burtons, because there was a window where if you just put them in a deal, a second and Jermaine Burton at the right time looked mighty sexy to the team that was looking like they were going to tank this year, right? Yeah, but it was a short-term window. But having those trigger players, those young players that start to just look like they have some semblance of future, having a couple of those just tacked on your bench and be willing to just throw them in and go, here you go, you can have them in a deal. There's always a window. That's why when we talk about during draft season, like, you want to have a couple shares of the Kamani Vidals of the world, just because you never know. Now, you have to have the discipline when it looks like Kamani Vidal is going to get work. You have to have the discipline to be able to make that trade. A lot of us, and I'm guilty of it too, with Jermaine Burton and Jalen McMillan. Oh man, this is their opportunity, Theo. I'm not selling them. Then they go out and bust, and guess what? They're actually worth less. because they've been exposed. The community now sees them as like they have stink on them. They're less likely to want them now than they were 2 weeks ago when they hadn't even gotten any opportunity to begin with. So you got to be careful with those guys. We sometimes think, oh man, this is the week Burton's starting. And then he doesn't. And then you're like, damn, I held too long and then I'm holding the bag. And I was acknowledging the bag when I drafted him and I still held through it. So I didn't have the discipline.
Yeah, I love it. And I can't wait to talk about this 2025 class with you at some point. But I think one thing that you've done very well is talk about guys with name recognition where the community will like them and it creates opportunities for you to make a future deal. That goes into your decision-making. I think that's really high-level stuff. But let's quickly get your opinion on Tracy. Tracy is one where if you look at 10 different dynasty rankings right now, you'll see variance with where he's ranked. I recommended him as a dynasty buy in my article at Fantasy Points that came out this week. I think he's a outlier. I think he's an outlier in terms of tread on the tires, experience at the running back position, and draft capital. I think he's a guy that's going to last through next year. And I think it'll be one of these situations where he has to dodge some bullets. And if he dodges some offseason bullets, I think people are going to be very enthusiastic about him next season. But there's other people who are like, I've seen some sharp people that we know who moved Tyrone Tracy, 25-year-old running back, day 3 pick. He's gained all this value like clockwork. Where is Scott Connor at with Tyrone Tracy?
Yeah, give me an example of kind of what you've heard somebody that's wanted to move him. Well, what have they cited as the reasons?
Exactly what I said. So a person that we know who's very, very sharp, who's won a lot of money in this game, said that they'd moved him straight up for a Keon Coleman recently. So, okay. And I said, I don't know about that one. I said, I would like maybe push back on that. Now, Keon's, I don't think this is like, it's some guy that's a bust. I think Keon's pretty good, and Keon's had some production this year, and Keon's obviously attached to Josh Allen. But I think a year, like if we get to a point where we get through the NFL draft, I think that once we get through the NFL draft, I'm going to be able to get a little bit more for Tyrone Tracy. It just, my gut feel, it's really a eye of the beholder player like we haven't seen in quite some time.
Well, I think I like the way you explain that, though, because I live in Ohio. It snows a lot here. There are certain times during the season where I would probably rather have a 4-wheel drive truck than I would a sports car. But they might be the same value, right? But that's basically what you're doing when you move a guy like Tracy for Keon Coleman. You're not necessarily saying Keon Coleman is great, but I'm guessing the analysis of that trade was my goal is to move Tyrone Tracy for something better, but you probably can't get the something better directly with Tyrone Tracy. So you're shifting him into another player that even if you don't think Keon Coleman gets there, maybe there's higher likelihood because he's a receiver, because he's attached to Josh Allen, because he's been not bad as a rookie. I think that's a solid move as long as your analysis isn't I'm fading Tyrone Tracy because of his profile and I'm buying Keon Coleman because of his. Really what you're doing is you're just trying to buy yourself some time to probably get to an even better asset than what you traded for. And it's very hard to do that with exactly what you said. A day 3 older running back on a bad team. Like what is the sell for Tyrone Tracy going to be in the offseason? If anything, he faces a lot of downside in terms of people looking at him saying, I don't know about that guy, because anything negative that happens, any thought that they're going to sign another guy or draft another guy, he doesn't change. His profile doesn't change. His role probably doesn't change. But in other people's eyes, he's not nearly as a desirable of an asset, right? Yep. Whereas Keon Coleman, you're like, okay, he's only going to get better, right? He gets better. He's got a year under his belt. I mean, all the same narratives. But I just wish that person that made that trade literally would just say it as, I'm trying to park my asset in a little bit of a smarter investment. That's it.
No, for sure. I think you could go really both ways. And I think let us know in the chat, if you're watching this one on YouTube, what you're doing with your Tyrone Tracy shares. Scott, I want to get you out of here. Give us one under the radar player, because I thought this was an interesting one. You gave us Will Dissly. Who's a running back that people can go get right now for peanuts that might have some value down the line?
Yeah, my player was Javonte Williams. I mean, I actually said this a couple weeks ago, but then, he he had a decent game this past week. So people have kind of forgotten about the, Audric Estime's taking over the backfield. But imagine if that would have continued for another week, right? I mean, what you'd be able to get Javonte Williams at what he's a third string running back price. I sell him. I'll take a third for him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's
Clear
relegated
to type guy. Get him off.
He's any running back on a 53 now. He's Jerome Ford. You know what I mean? Like he's just another guy that nobody really wants. But I do think if you're going to buy into the NFL kind of shifting in terms of how they view running backs, if you're accepting that every running back is going to have a Batman and Robin situation, a 60-40 split type of situation, very few guys are able to rise above that. Hell, we have some of the best running backs in the league right now that are still in that type of situation, and that is what it is. Then you have guys like Chase Brown who don't, like it's random. So I think Javonte just lands on his feet. He gets a solid contract. You've seen the contracts that have been given out to somebody like Chuba Hubbard. I think that's going to be an indication of what teams value players like Javonte Williams, players like Najee Harris going forward. Like NFL teams are going to immediately have a role for them. Now, I think where he lands, what team he goes to, what coach it is, how good their offensive line is, who the other person in their backfield is, how much do people like or dislike that player compared to Javonte. But I mean, look at how people viewed DeAndre Swift versus Roschon Johnson.
Yeah.
Roschon's good. DeAndre Swift sucks. And it's been the complete opposite. You know what I mean? So I think he just lands in one of those committees. We may or may not like it, but I feel like you can probably get him, especially if the Estime usage jolts up again and Javonte has another, 4-point game. That's a player I want to go into next year with, a decent amount of exposure, maybe 10 to 20% across my leagues.
No, I love it. And I love the rationale. And I love that you tied Najee in. That's a guy that we've talked about with one another about how some of these guys, Scott, where once the profile sort of exists with these players, it gets attached to them. This is a guy where when they get the next contract, there's going to be a coach that says, I want that guy. Look at Jerry Jeudy. Jerry Jeudy got a massive deal in Cleveland. And maybe you disagreed with that deal, but I think a lot of that goes back to what he was as a prospect coming out of Alabama. He's 25 years old. We can make this guy work. I mean, it happens time and time again.
And he's good.
Yeah, and he's good.
But we punish him in the Dynasty community because he's not great. And we thought he would be great. And he's just good. You know what I mean? Hey, I keep saying DeAndre Swift, but that is DeAndre Swift has averaged 14.5 points per game for his fantasy career.
Yeah, DeAndre Swift has been an RB1.
People would tell you that he sucks and he shouldn't have a job, and the NFL is like, nah, we want to give this guy a job. We want to give him an opportunity over and over and over and over and over. But because he didn't become Christian McCaffrey, we've overcorrected and just punished him into oblivion. And Jerry Jeudy is another great example of a guy like, oh yeah, he's a dog. And then no, he's actually like a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. And he's going to be very volatile based on who his quarterback is. You know what I mean? Like there's going to be volatility, but he doesn't suck. You shouldn't just get rid of him. So
100%. Scott, let everybody know what you have coming up and whenever they can find your work.
Yeah, Theo, appreciate you having me on. Always a good time. Chop it up with you. You can find me, everything I do at ddfantasyfootball.com. Check out the site. That's where you can find the Trinity tracker. Join our Discord if you're interested. We have a bunch of proprietary shows. That's where most of my content, quite frankly, is. I do a weekly podcast, but everything else we do inside of our community. So Shane and I do our Manic and Chill show in there. Ray does his Trinity Report show in there. I host a show with Jeff Mueller every week. We talk injuries with him in there. So that's where it's at, ddfantasyfootball.com. Check it out and message me if you have any questions on it, or maybe I'll toss you a bone for a 50% discount code if you want to try it out.
Scott throwing out 50%ers. Scott, you could have said 25%. He's throwing out 50s. Highly recommend all of those guys. Everybody you referenced. Shane's great. Ray's great. Everybody who's been on Dynasty Life, you're working with all those guys. We're going to come back here, another Dynasty Life, maybe next week, maybe the week after Thanksgiving. We want to help you crush your Dynasty Leagues the rest of the way. We'll see you soon.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.